In the quiet year of 1980, a chilling mystery shook a devout and secluded village nestled in the forests of Northern California. 4 nuns, beloved by their tight-knit Catholic community, vanished without leaving the slightest clue behind. No footprints, no goodbye notes, no sightings. They were simply gone. The tragedy left the townspeople of Eldon Hollow reeling in sorrow and steeped in unanswered questions. Their absence carved a hollow place in every soul that had once found comfort in their presence. Nearly 3 decades later, the village's spiritual center, St. Agnes of Mercy Church, stood as a symbol of enduring faith and quiet mourning. The morning sun streamed through the elaborate stained glass windows, casting luminous patches of red, blue, and gold onto the smooth, time-worn wooden pews. At the front altar stood Father Elias Moreau, his weathered face solemn as he delivered the closing prayer of a memorial service that had become a yearly ritual. "May the souls of the departed," he intoned gravely, raising his hand to mark the sign of the cross, "through God's boundless mercy, find eternal rest." The assembled congregation, their voices unified in somber reverence, responded, "Amen." Father Elias surveyed the crowd before him, faces aged by time, many marked by wrinkles and fading hair. Some were his longtime parishioners, elders who remembered the nuns personally. Others were the next generation, children of those who had once learned under the sisters' tutelage, now adults carrying inherited grief. They had gathered to honor the memory of the 4 women whose disappearance had haunted their town like a specter, refusing to fade with time. As the service drew to a close, Father Elias moved with measured grace to the entrance of the church, where he stood to greet each departing soul. The congregants passed by one at a time, offering soft-spoken condolences that had over the years lost their rawness and become something almost ceremonial. "Thank you for being here, Mrs. Harmon," Father Elias said, gently grasping the frail, veined hands of an elderly woman. "I always come, Father," she replied, her eyes shimmering with the tears of long-suppressed sorrow. "Sister Mildred once taught my children their catechism. She was such a kind and patient woman." He nodded, feeling a familiar deep ache. Sister Mildred Hayes had been a pillar of compassion and discipline, 68 years old when she disappeared, having spent her entire life in humble service to her faith. The thought that her final days were a mystery, possibly filled with fear or pain, tormented him. As the church slowly emptied, each person stepped into the bright morning carrying the weight of memory. Sister Mildred Hayes, aged 68, Sister Joan Caller, 65, Sister Beatrice Namora, only 28, and the youngest among them, Sister Ters Morrow, merely 23. For Father Elias, the pain was not just spiritual. It was deeply personal. Ters had not only been a sister in faith, she was his blood, his younger sister. Her loss had devastated him in ways words could never fully capture. Her disappearance hadn't just wounded his heart, it had wounded his trust in divine providence. Once the last mourner had departed, leaving the church draped in stillness, Father Elias made his way down the central aisle, his footsteps echoing faintly in the hallowed silence. He passed the rows of now empty pews, lit in a prism of stained light, and turned toward the rear of the sanctuary, where his modest office awaited. The room was simple, like the man who occupied it. A small desk, some shelves lined with theological works, and a window offering a quiet view of the churchyard and its cemetery. He closed the door gently behind him and sank into the worn leather chair behind the desk, his body folding inward as though crumbling under invisible weight. His hands came up to cover his face, and in the solitude of that sacred space, the mask fell away. His shoulders trembled as tears broke free, silent sobs racking his frame. He allowed himself this fragile indulgence only once a year, on the anniversary that marked his sister's vanishing. It was the one day when the facade he wore for the sake of his congregation could no longer hold. "You, Lord," he whispered brokenly, his voice coarse with grief, "why did you allow this to happen? I have served you faithfully. My sister devoted her entire life to you, and yet you've given us no answers, no peace. What is the lesson I have failed to grasp?" Eventually, the storm of sorrow passed. He wiped his eyes with the cuff of his sleeve and opened the bottom drawer of his desk. From within, he retrieved a small wooden box, hand-carved, its surface polished smooth with age. He lifted the lid reverently. Inside lay a few cherished photographs, their edges worn soft from frequent handling. The first image he lifted out was of Ters, captured on the day she had taken her final vows. Her young face glowed with joy and solemn purpose. Beneath the traditional veil, her eyes shone with a conviction that had moved even the most stoic elders of the church. Father Elias stared at it, overwhelmed by a mixture of pride and guilt. He had encouraged her to pursue her calling. He had celebrated her ordination. And yet, if I hadn't urged you down that path, he murmured, his fingers tracing the outline of her smile, would you still be here today? Living a full life, maybe teaching children of your own? But he stopped himself, swiftly raising his hand in the sign of the cross. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, he whispered, forcing the dangerous thought from his mind. It was sacrilegious to doubt the path of divine will, even in despair. He placed Ters's photo gently back into the box and reached for another. This one was the last known image of the 4 missing nuns. They sat together on a rustic bench just outside a weathered chapel nestled near the edge of Shasta Trinity National Forest. St. Dymphna's, a secluded outpost rarely visited even by locals. Sister Mildred and Sister Joan sat side by side, hands folded in their laps, their faces calm and dignified. Sister Beatrice, younger and more relaxed in posture, still exuded reverence, and Ters, sweet, determined Ters, sat at the edge, her eyes filled with eager determination, even in the faded photograph. That photo had been taken only days before their disappearance. They had gone to St. Dymphna's for a brief spiritual retreat, 2 days of fasting, reflection, and silence to prepare for a holy feast. The diocese had also requested they evaluate the deteriorating chapel to decide whether it should be restored or left to the wilderness. Ters, known for her sharp eye and attention to detail, had been assigned the task of documenting its structural condition. Father Elias stared at the image, his mind drifting to calculations he had done far too many times. Had they lived, Sister Mildred would now be 96, Sister Joan 93. Their chances of survival were infinitesimal. But Beatrice? She would be 56. Ters just 51. Still young enough to be living full, meaningful lives, if fate had been kinder. Father Elias's thoughts drifted back to those frenzied, agonizing days that had followed the disappearance. He remembered the sleepless nights, the desperate prayers, the ache of helplessness that had hollowed out his chest. Authorities had responded quickly, with search teams dispatched into the Shasta Trinity wilderness. Officers had combed through the thick underbrush, scaled the craggy hillsides, and surveyed every nearby ravine and trail. Volunteers had joined from surrounding villages and farms, fanning out through the rolling terrain with flashlights, dogs, and hope. Flyers had been posted in towns miles away, even as far as Reading, yet despite the enormous effort, not a single shred of evidence had ever been uncovered. No veils snagged on bushes, no discarded rosaries, no footprints trailing off into the woods, no signs of a struggle or accident. It was as if the 4 women had walked into the dense forest and dissolved into air. Eventually, the official investigation had to conclude something. The theory settled on an unfortunate but not unheard of scenario, a wildlife encounter gone tragically wrong. The Shasta Trinity National Forest, while stunningly beautiful, was known to harbor bears, especially black bears, that could react unpredictably when startled or if their territory felt threatened. Perhaps, officials speculated, the sisters had ventured too far into the forest, straying from the retreat grounds. Maybe they encountered an aggressive animal. Perhaps one of them fell or panicked, drawing attention and triggering an attack. But even that theory had always felt thin and hollow to Father Elias. It lacked the necessary weight. The utter absence of evidence, not even a torn scrap of fabric or a bloodstain on the earth, left a void in its logic. Something had happened. Something more than nature and misfortune. And over the years, darker whispers had emerged. He'd heard them murmured in corners of the church, seen them written anonymously in letters addressed to the diocese. Rumors that the women hadn't been victims, but participants, that they had shed their habits, abandoned their vows, and fled into new lives under false names. Some even suggested they had been lovers, that the retreat had been a cover for escape. The cruelest tales painted the women as deceivers who had turned their backs not just on their faith, but on those who had loved and trusted them. Father Elias and the parish had worked tirelessly to combat these narratives, issuing statements, preaching sermons about trust, devotion, and the truth known only to God. Still, seeds of doubt once planted were hard to uproot. "She would never," Elias whispered, barely audibly, tracing his fingertip along his sister's serene face in the photograph. "Ters would never have left without telling me, not her." His gaze drifted past her face to the backdrop of the image, the humble chapel that had framed their final known moment together. Saint Dymphna's, known affectionately as Saint Denas, stood in the distance like a quiet sentinel. Built in the early 1920s to serve remote Catholic communities, it had once been a beacon of spiritual solace for farmers and hunters alike. Its white wooden walls, the modest bell tower that had summoned parishioners for Sunday Mass, and the tall pines encircling it all, formed a tableau of peace and simplicity. Something shifted within Father Elias as he studied it. He hadn't returned to St. Denis in over 2 decades. The memories tied to it were too raw, too painful to bear. But now, as he sat alone in his office on the 28th anniversary of their disappearance, he felt a stirring, an undeniable tug in his spirit. Maybe it was mere nostalgia, a desire to connect with the last place his sister had walked and prayed. Or maybe, just maybe, it was something deeper, a whisper in his soul suggesting that something still waited for him there. That not every stone had been turned, that after all these years, a clue might yet remain, unnoticed by the search teams or faded with time. It was likely a foolish hope, but hope nonetheless. Father Elias reverently placed the photographs back into their box, save for the one of the 4 sisters outside St. Denis. That he carefully folded and slipped into his jacket pocket. Rising from his chair, he reached for his Bible and rosary, his anchors, and left his office with purpose. In the parking lot outside the church, he opened the door of his aging sedan, slid into the driver's seat, and placed the photograph on the passenger's side as if it were a silent companion. He bowed his head, whispering a prayer for guidance and protection. Then he turned the ignition and pulled away from St. Agnes, driving toward a place both sacred and haunted. The road out of Eldon Hollow wound through gentle hills and farmland, the landscape shifting gradually with each mile. First came neat rows of homes, their yards tidy and filled with flowering bushes. Then the open farmland, fields stretching toward the horizon, dotted with barns and grazing livestock. And then the wildness began. Trees crowded closer to the road, their tall trunks casting dappled shadows as Father Elias drove deeper into the edge of the forest. It took him nearly an hour and a half to reach the foothills of the Shasta Trinity National Forest. During the drive, he reflected on the countless times he had made this same journey in the frantic days after the disappearance. Back then, his vehicle had been stuffed with missing person flyers, his heart beating wildly with desperate hope. Every road sign had seemed like a potential breakthrough, every turnoff a possible miracle. Now the drive felt quieter. The hope was dimmer, tempered by years of disappointment. Still, the yearning had not completely vanished. As the forest thickened, the road began to climb. Father Elias reduced his speed, watching carefully for the small dirt path that had once led to St. Denis Chapel. But when he reached the area he believed to be the right place, confusion clouded his face. Where there should have been a rutted trail cutting into the trees, he found instead a freshly paved private road, neatly maintained and blocked by an ornate wrought iron gate. Attached to the gate was a stern, "No trespassing" sign, accompanied by several smaller warnings: private property, surveillance in use, keep out. "This can't be it," he murmured aloud, pulling his car to the shoulder. He reached for the photograph, holding it up and comparing the contours of the mountains and the arrangement of trees to the landscape before him. The match was unmistakable. The forest ridge, the tall cluster of firs, even the slope of the land. This was the same location. But where was the chapel? Stepping out of his vehicle, Father Elias approached the gate on foot. Beyond it, the paved road curved gently into the trees, flanked by ornamental shrubs and young maples planted in symmetrical rows. The entire area had been transformed, landscaped, and developed, and of the small white chapel, there was no sign. It had vanished as completely as the nuns who once stood before it. Baffled, Elias pulled out his phone. He scrolled through his contacts until he found a familiar name, Harold Gibbons, who had once served as caretaker of St. Dina's. It had been years since they last spoke, but if anyone could shed light on what had become of the chapel, it was Harold. The phone rang several times before a gravelly voice answered. "Hello? Harold, this is Father Elias Morrow from St. Agnes in Eldon Hollow." There was a pause, followed by a warm flicker of recognition. "Father Elias, my goodness, been a long time. How are you?" "I'm well," Elias replied, though the tremor in his voice betrayed the truth. "Harold, I am standing where St. Dina's chapel used to be. But it's gone." Another longer pause, then Harold spoke again, his tone heavy. "Yes, Father, the diocese decommissioned it in '82, sold the land shortly after. A man named Silas Redwood bought it, tore everything down." A chill ran through Father Elias, despite the warmth of the afternoon sun. He never heard anything about the chapel being sold, let alone torn down, Father Elias murmured, his voice tinged with disbelief. On the other end of the phone, Harold Gibbons responded with a sigh that carried years of resignation. "Well, attendance dropped off hard after the sisters went missing. Folks were scared, confused. And then not long after that, the bell tower cracked. Almost came down on poor Tommy Frell. Bishop Parnell figured it wasn't worth the upkeep for such a remote congregation, especially with all the bad memories attached. They quietly decommissioned it, and a year or so later sold the land." Father Elias stood silently, his eyes once again fixed on the stark "no trespassing" sign fastened to the ornate gate in front of him. A creeping unease began to settle into his bones. "And the man who bought it, this Silas Redwood, he still owns it?" "Oh yes," Harold confirmed without hesitation. "He's got quite the estate now. His main house is somewhere deeper into the woods, near where the old retreat path used to run. The spot where the chapel stood, that's just one corner of his property now." "I see," Elias replied slowly, his words trailing off into thought. "I had hoped to visit the chapel today, for personal reasons. It's the anniversary, you understand." Harold's voice softened at once, his tone shifting to one of heartfelt sympathy. "Of course, Father. I'd almost forgotten. 28 years today, isn't it? I'm so sorry you came all this way only to find it gone." Elias hesitated. "Do you know if Mr. Redwood is the sort to receive visitors? I mean, under the circumstances, if I explained my reason for being here?" "To be honest," Harold interrupted gently, "he's not exactly the friendly type. Keeps to himself mostly. Doesn't interact with the community much, if at all. A bit of a recluse by all accounts." Father Elias exhaled slowly, the breath heavy with disappointment. The weight of dashed expectations settled across his shoulders. "Well, thank you for the information, Harold. I appreciate you taking the time." There was a brief pause, and then Harold's voice returned with a spark of warmth. "Listen, Father. I still live nearby, less than 15 minutes from where you are now. When the chapel was being cleared out, I saved a few things. The altar's crucifix, some of the old hymnals, and even a couple of prayer books with the sisters' handwritten notes in the margins. You're welcome to come by and see them if you'd like. Might be comforting." "That's very kind of you," Elias replied, touched by the offer. "And I just might take you up on it. But first, I feel I must at least try to speak with Mr. Redwood. Is there a way to reach his house directly?" Harold hesitated, clearly reluctant. "Well, you've already seen the private road, and that gate's always locked. But there's another way, an old public road that loops around and skirts the edge of his land. It'll bring you close enough to maybe catch someone outside. I'll give you the directions." Elias jotted down Harold's instructions, thanked him again, and ended the call. As he stood beside his car, he felt a quiet conflict rising within him. A part of him whispered that it was wrong to impose. Redwood had every right to his privacy. but a stronger impulse, rooted in grief and a deep yearning for resolution, urged him to continue. And so he did. Roughly 20 minutes later, Father Elias found himself navigating a narrow road lined with towering trees. Through sporadic gaps in the foliage, he glimpsed wide stretches of manicured grass and flower beds, surprisingly well tended for a property this deep in the forest. Eventually, he rounded a bend and caught sight of a striking structure nestled against the slope of a wooded hill. The house, or rather the mansion, stood 3 stories tall, constructed of dark stone and timber beams that gave it the look of a luxurious mountain lodge. Expansive windows reflected the surrounding trees, and multiple terraces jutted out at varying levels, suggesting outdoor spaces designed for comfort and leisure. The home was beautiful, yet it felt strangely out of place in such a modest and forgotten corner of the world. Father Elias pulled into a small gravel turnout near what appeared to be a side entrance. He straightened his clerical collar, smoothed the front of his jacket, and stepped out of the vehicle. His shoes crunched softly on the gravel as he approached the front of the house. A stone pathway led through carefully manicured gardens and past a decorative pond, where koi darted beneath the surface. Despite the serenity of the landscaping, Elias couldn't shake the faint sense of being watched. When he reached the solid oak door, he paused a moment, collecting himself, and knocked firmly. The door opened almost immediately, as if someone had been waiting just inside. Standing before him was a tall, lean man, likely in his early 60s. His athletic frame was dressed in tailored exercise clothes, and he held a leather dog leash loosely in one hand. His hair, silver and neatly trimmed, framed a face of sharp lines and hard eyes. As he took in the sight of Father Elias's clerical collar, his expression shifted from bland curiosity to clear irritation. "Yes," he asked curtly, not bothering to hide the annoyance in his voice. "Good afternoon," Elias began with a warm smile. "Are you Mr. Silas Redwood?" The man's jaw tensed. "I am. And you are trespassing on private property." "I apologize for the intrusion," Elias said calmly, extending a hand. "My name is Father Elias Mero. I'm from St. Agnes of Mercy Church in Eldon Hollow." Redwood ignored the outstretched hand. "What do you want?" he demanded, his fingers tightening around the leash. "I was hoping to speak with you for just a few minutes," Elias said gently. "I visited the place where St. Dana's chapel once stood, and I was surprised to find it gone." "If you saw it's gone," Redwood snapped, "why are you here bothering me?" "I spoke with Harold Gibbons, the former caretaker," Elias explained. "He told me you had purchased the property. I just wanted to—" "To what?" Redwood interrupted, stepping forward, his voice rising. "Blame me for buying land that was for sale? Are you one of those who think that a patch of dirt is somehow holy? The diocese didn't think so. They sold it off without a second thought." No, Elias said quickly, raising his hands in a peaceful gesture. "I'm not here to argue. I don't hold you responsible for anything. I didn't know the chapel had been demolished. It held deep personal meaning for me." Redwood's posture eased slightly, though the chill in his eyes remained. "Well, now you know. It's gone, and good riddance. That damned bell used to ring 3 times a day like clockwork. Gave me migraines." Elias couldn't help himself. "That bell was called the Angelus," he said softly. "It's a sacred tradition. It reminds us of God's presence, of the incarnation, of our freedom from sin." Redwood scoffed, turning away. "Spare me the sermon, Padre. People don't need bells anymore. If they want to pray, they can set an alarm on their phones. They don't need to disturb the entire countryside with medieval noise pollution," Redwood added with a sneer. It was clear the conversation was going nowhere constructive. Recognizing the growing tension and the futility of pressing further, Father Elias decided to shift course, adopting a gentler tone. "I understand that you value your privacy, Mr. Redwood, and I recognize that I've come here unannounced, intruding on your day. For that, I truly apologize. Perhaps, if it's not too much trouble, we could speak another time, on a day more convenient for you." Redwood's expression remained impassive, his jaw set like stone. "There won't be another day," he said flatly. I have no interest in discussing a building that hasn't existed for decades, especially not with a priest I've never met until 5 minutes ago. Now, I suggest you get back in your car and leave before I call the sheriff and report you for trespassing." Seeing no point in further confrontation, Father Elias simply nodded. "Very well. Thank you for your time, Mr. Redwood. Peace be with you." Without another word, Redwood closed the door with deliberate finality, the heavy wood thudding shut like a judge's gavel. Elias stood for a moment, unmoving, absorbing the cold rebuff. Then he turned, walking slowly back down the stone path toward his car. The encounter had left him with a deep sense of unease, not just disappointment but something darker. Redwood's hostility had been more than simple annoyance. There was a palpable bitterness, a visceral disdain not just for Elias, but for everything he represented. Something about the man's reaction felt personal. As he reached his vehicle, Elias cast a glance back at the imposing house. Was it his imagination, or was there a silhouette behind the upper window curtain? A flicker of movement suggested he was still being watched. The sensation prickled along the back of his neck, but he said nothing, simply lowering himself into the driver's seat and starting the engine. He sat for a moment, hands resting on the steering wheel, weighing his options. He could return to Eldon Hollow and spend the evening in reflection. Or he could take up Harold Gibbons's offer and visit his home to view the salvaged items from the chapel. Perhaps those relics, fragments of the past, would provide the closure that had eluded him all day. But something else stirred within him. Instead of heading back, he found his vehicle drifting down a different road, one that would pass close to where St. Denis Chapel had once stood. He couldn't explain the compulsion. He knew there was nothing left to see, and yet something deeper urged him on. A memory, a voice, a pull from within. As the car rounded a familiar bend, he slowed, eyes scanning the landscape. Through a break in the trees, he could see the clearing where the chapel had once stood. It had since been landscaped. Manicured shrubs and decorative trees replaced the wild brush of decades past. But he recognized the lay of the land. Then, without warning, the car's radio crackled to life. The speakers emitted a sound so haunting, so unmistakable, that Father Elias gripped the steering wheel tighter in startled disbelief. Gregorian chant, solemn, resonant, and sacred, poured from the speakers, the ethereal voices of monks in unison, echoing ancient words of praise and lament. Except the radio had been off. He was certain of it. He hadn't touched it since leaving Eldon Hollow. Staring at the dashboard, he reached out and turned the knob, switching the radio on and off again. The music disappeared as suddenly as it had come. The silence returned. "What on earth?" he whispered to himself, fingers hovering uncertainly over the controls. Had he imagined it? A hallucination, perhaps, brought on by fatigue and emotional strain? Or was it some strange quirk of his aging car's electronics? And yet, as he sat there, something else washed over him, a sensation he couldn't easily dismiss, a weightless pressure around his chest. A tingling warmth filled his ears and the space behind his eyes. His skin prickled as if touched by invisible hands. He had felt this before, during moments of profound spiritual clarity, during silent retreats in the seminary, during long nights of prayer, during times when he felt the presence of something divine just on the edge of perception. His spiritual director had called it a prompting of the spirit. And now, there it was again. The chanting returned, faint but undeniable, as if beckoning him. This time, he didn't doubt it. He wasn't imagining things. With sudden resolve, Father Elias shifted the car into gear, executed a careful U-turn, and headed back toward the gated entrance to Redwood's estate. He didn't know what he hoped to find, only that he was meant to be there. Once more, he parked on the side of the road, just short of the iron gate with its stark warnings. He sat for a moment, engine idling, eyes fixed on the barrier. Doubt crept in. Was he about to make a mistake? "Lord, guide my actions," he prayed aloud. "If I am about to err in judgment, show me the right path." No answer came, but the conviction in his heart only grew stronger. After a moment he stepped out of the car, shut the door softly behind him and approached the gate. He did not attempt to climb it. Trespassing in the literal sense was still a sin, but he began to walk along its perimeter, scanning the forest for a vantage point. The fence was tall and elaborately wrought, at least 8 feet high, and curved to follow the natural rise and fall of the terrain. In some places the ground rose to meet it more closely, and Elias searched for one of these spots. As he moved through the underbrush, memories flooded back. He closed his eyes and tried to picture St. Denis as it once was. The way the morning light shone through its modest stained glass, the hush that fell over the pews during quiet prayer, the soft creak of the chapel's wooden floor. He remembered the wooden bench in the photograph, the one where the sisters had sat for their final picture. If memory served, it had stood just east of the chapel, beneath a great oak tree. Opening his eyes, he turned in that direction. "I don't need to wake the whole countryside with medieval noise pollution," Redwood muttered with undisguised contempt, his voice trailing behind him like a closing door. It was clear that this conversation wasn't heading anywhere fruitful. The air had turned tense, laced with hostility. Recognizing the impasse, Father Elias opted to try a more conciliatory tone. "I understand that you value your privacy, Mr. Redwood," he said gently, his voice measured and respectful. "And I acknowledge that I've come uninvited, unannounced. For that, I sincerely apologize. If today is not a good time, perhaps we could arrange another day when it's more convenient for you?" Redwood's reply came swiftly, sharp as a blade. "There will not be another day," he said flatly. "I have no desire to revisit memories of a church that's been gone for decades, especially not with a priest I've never spoken to before now. I'd advise you to get in your car and drive away before I involve law enforcement. And I advise Aiden." Father Elias nodded, feeling the doors of communication slam shut before him. He gave a small bow of acknowledgement. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Redwood. May peace find you." Without another word, Redwood pushed the door closed with firm finality. The heavy oak thudded against its frame, leaving Elias standing alone on the stone porch. For a moment, Elias didn't move. He stood quietly, allowing the stillness to wash over him. Then he turned and walked slowly back down the manicured path, past the pond and flower beds, toward his car. Each step was heavier than the last, not from exhaustion, but from the invisible weight of disappointment and lingering unease. It wasn't just Redwood's rudeness that troubled him. It was the vehemence in his tone, the way his eyes had darkened at the mere mention of the chapel. There was something beneath the surface, something more than irritation, a deeper resentment, perhaps even fear. Reaching his vehicle, Elias paused and looked back toward the imposing lodge. A flicker of motion drew his gaze upward. Was someone peering through one of the upper windows? The curtains twitched, or perhaps it was just a trick of the wind. Still, the sensation of being watched crept over him like a shadow. He climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine, his hands gripping the steering wheel with hesitation. He could return to Eldon Hollow now, or he could accept Harold Gibbons' offer to see the salvaged artifacts from the decommissioned chapel. Perhaps those relics, crosses, hymnals, prayer books, would give him the closure he sought. Yet something else tugged at him. Instead of turning back, he found himself taking the road that traced the edge of the property, the same route that passed close to the site where St. Denis had once stood. Logic told him there was nothing to see. Still, he couldn't resist the pull. The car eased around a bend, and through a thinning patch of trees, Elias spotted the old location of the chapel. The familiar rise in the terrain was still there, now tastefully landscaped with shrubs and flowering bushes. The ground where the chapel once stood was now part of a larger estate, groomed to perfection, but Elias's heart recognized it instantly. Then the unexpected happened. The car's radio, silent for the entire drive, suddenly crackled to life. A soft, haunting melody filled the cabin, not static, not a voice, but Gregorian chant, deep, solemn, and unmistakable. The ancient harmonies of monastic prayer swirled around him. But the radio was off, he was sure of it. His hands tightened on the steering wheel as the music rose. The sound was both beautiful and eerie, like an echo from another world. Elias reached out and flicked the dial, switching the radio on, then off again. The chanting faded, then vanished. He stared at the dashboard, bewildered. What in heaven's name? He murmured. Had he imagined it? Was it a figment conjured by fatigue, stress, or emotion? A momentary lapse in his aging vehicle's electrical system? Yet, as he sat there, he felt something else. A presence. Not threatening, but powerful. A weight in the air. A deep stirring in his chest, like the tremor before revelation. The hair on his arms rose. His breath caught in his throat. He'd known this feeling before. During nights of silent prayer, moments of divine encounter. His spiritual director in seminary had taught him to recognize these moments for what they might be, promptings from the Holy Spirit. Then, again, the chant returned, this time, more clearly. He didn't question it. He knew it wasn't his imagination. Something was calling him. He took a deep breath, turned the steering wheel, and guided the car back toward the main gate that separated Redwood's estate from the public road. He parked once again near the edge of the forest, just out of sight from the house, his engine idling for a few seconds before he switched it off. The iron gate loomed before him, adorned with sharp finials and harsh signage. Private property, no trespass, surveillance in use. He bowed his head. Lord, he whispered, if I am about to act unwisely, give me clarity. But if this is your will, if this is something I'm meant to follow, then show me the way. The air was still, but the sensation remained, urging him forward. He stepped out of the car and approached the perimeter cautiously. Trespassing was a serious matter, both legally and morally. As a priest, he held himself to the highest standards, but the prompting he felt, the whisper in his spirit, outweighed his usual caution. Rather than attempting to climb the gate or break through, he followed the fencing along its outer edge. The metalwork was ornate but solid, about 8 feet tall, and it curved gently with the landscape, rising and falling with the forest floor. As he moved through the trees, he closed his eyes briefly, drawing from memory. He pictured the layout of St. Denis as it had once stood. The altar near the eastern window, the small sacristy behind it. The bench, the one from the final photograph of the sisters, situated beneath a great oak tree. If he could find that tree, perhaps he could reconnect with that moment. Perhaps the answers he sought were not inside the house, but still anchored to the land. He opened his eyes and scanned the terrain. There, in the distance, he spotted a familiar silhouette. The massive oak, its wide branches stretching like open arms, stood alone, untouched by the recent landscaping. Fletcher was glad. He quickened his pace. With narrowed eyes and a deep breath, Father Elias scanned the land beyond the iron fence, searching for anything familiar, any surviving landmarks that might have withstood the passing decades and the sweeping hand of renovation. The once mighty oak tree that had towered beside the chapel, standing like a guardian over sacred ground, was no longer there. He had hoped it might remain, a marker from the past, but clearly it had been removed, cleared away during Silas Redwood's extensive remodeling of the estate. Still, not all was unfamiliar. A thick grouping of pine trees stood stoically beyond the garden, forming a natural backdrop. He recognized them immediately. They had framed the back of the chapel, silent witnesses to sermons, prayers, and possibly the final moments of the 4 nuns who had vanished so long ago. Those pines gave him direction. Guided by memory, Father Elias continued walking along the perimeter fence, tracing the imagined line where the chapel walls had once stood. He moved slowly, his shoes brushing through fallen leaves and patches of overgrown grass. Every few steps, he paused to reorient himself, trying to reconcile the present landscape with the mental map etched in his memory. Then it happened, sudden and jarring. His foot caught on something hidden beneath the underbrush, a thick, gnarled root curling above the soil like a snake. He lost his balance instantly. His arms shot out and he lunged forward. Instinctively he grabbed the fence for support, but his weight drove him hard into the iron structure. The metal groaned under the pressure. There was a sharp, splitting sound. The fence, aged and poorly anchored in a patch of uneven ground, gave way. One of the posts wrenched free from the soil, tilting at an angle. The surrounding iron bars shifted and creaked, and suddenly a section of the fence collapsed inward with a metallic shriek, leaving a wide, jagged gap in its place. Father Elias landed awkwardly, his knee in the dirt and one leg partially through the opening. The fence rattled around him, leaves swirled in the afternoon breeze, as if the world had held its breath. "Oh, dear Lord," he muttered, blinking dust from his eyes. He scrambled upright, brushing soil from his hands and cassock. His heart pounded, not just from the fall, but from the implications of what had just occurred. He hadn't meant to damage anything, let alone forcibly create a way into the private estate. Yet here he stood, face to face with an unintended opportunity. Or was it something more? He turned his head, scanning the road behind him. No vehicles approached. The forest path was still. The air carried nothing but the rustling whispers of leaves dancing in the trees. He looked again at the broken section of the fence, then past it, toward the clearing. That was where St. Dina's had once stood. The very ground that had cradled generations of whispered prayers and vows now lay obscured under redwood's decorative landscaping. "Forgive me," he murmured, making the sign of the cross. His voice, soft and reverent, seemed to echo slightly in the quiet. With care and a sense of reluctant urgency, he stepped through the opening and crossed onto Silas Redwood's land. The cultivated grounds on this side of the fence felt like an artificial skin stretched tightly over sacred muscle. The soil beneath his feet was the same earth that had held the chapel's foundation, but the new decor, ornamental bushes, decorative stones, exotic flora, felt jarringly out of place, imported and imposed. Elias moved carefully, his eyes sweeping the terrain. He followed the memory of St. Dina's blueprint, the placement of its front steps, the sacristy, the altar, the side garden, but there were no signs, no cracked stones or outlines of a foundation, not even a weathered plaque. It was as though Redwood had gone to great lengths to erase every trace of the building and the lives it had once housed. A pang of sorrow welled in Elias's chest. It wasn't just the building that had been removed. It was the memory, the sanctity, the history, all of it buried beneath manicured mulch and ornamental hedges. Then something shimmered. A brief glint of reflected sunlight caught his eye, low to the ground, hidden partially beneath a sprawling shrub with waxy green leaves. Curious, he crouched and gently pushed the branches aside. There, nestled in the earth, was a metal grate. Its iron surface was dulled by rust and years of exposure, and the decorative scrollwork around its edges was unlike anything else in sight. It was clearly old, perhaps original to the chapel or even predating it. The design, elegant yet functional, didn't match Redwood's modern taste at all. Elias's brow furrowed. If the chapel had been thoroughly demolished, why would a ventilation grate remain? What was it? Ventilating. He leaned closer, resting on one knee. Air flowed gently through the slats, musty and cool. And then, like a whisper threading through the silence, a sound rose to meet him. A voice. No, not words, a hum. Low, melodic, feminine. He held his breath. Another sound followed. A soft, unmistakable cough. Invigorated. Elias's blood ran cold. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. This was no trick of the mind. It wasn't radio interference or some electrical hiccup like earlier in the car. This was real. Someone was below him, beneath the very spot where the chapel once stood. He lowered his mouth to the grate. "Hello?" he called, voice trembling. "Can you hear me?" No reply. The humming continued, unbroken, unaware. He tried again, louder. Still nothing. Oh, whoever was down there either couldn't hear him or couldn't respond. Rising to his feet, Elias scanned the area. There were no visible cameras, no sounds of approaching footsteps. The main house was hidden behind a screen of trees, and the garden seemed momentarily forgotten. He pulled his phone from his pocket and dialed. 911, what's your emergency? This is Father Elias Morrow, he said quickly, though quietly. I'm on the property of Silas Redwood, near Route 37. near the site of the old St. Dana's chapel. A pause. Yes, Father? I believe someone is underground, beneath the property. I can hear humming and coughing through a ventilation grate. Another pause. Are you suggesting someone is trapped or being held? I don't know, Elias admitted, but something is terribly wrong. This area is remote, private, and whoever is down there, they're not supposed to be. Are you on the property with permission? He winced. No. I damaged a part of the fence and stepped through. I know I'm trespassing, but this is an emergency. Please, send help. Describe your location, the dispatcher instructed. Elias explained everything he could, including nearby landmarks and the fence's breakpoint. Officers are en route. Remain near your vehicle unless you feel threatened. Understood, Elias replied. He ended the call and turned back toward the grate. The humming had stopped. Now only silence lingered in the garden air. Even as he backed away from the hidden vent, Father Elias could still hear it, the faint, irregular shuffling of movement below, echoing up from the dark through rusted iron bars. There was no longer any doubt in his mind. Someone was beneath that earth, and the realization wrapped cold fingers around his spine. Each noise was another confirmation that this wasn't imagination or memory. It was real, and it was happening now. With his thoughts racing and urgency mounting, Father Elias made his way back toward the broken section of the fence. The twisted metal was still bent where he had fallen through, a jagged wound in redwood's perimeter. He eased through it cautiously, trying not to cause further damage, and emerged onto the public road, where his car still waited. Sliding into the driver's seat, he immediately reached for his phone and dialed Harold Gibbons. The line rang once, then twice, before the familiar voice of the former caretaker answered. "Harold, it's Father Elias again," he said, barely pausing for breath. "I need to ask you something urgently." "Of course, Father. What is it?" St. Dana's chapel was still standing. Was there ever any basement? A crypt, storm shelter, storage cellar, anything underground at all? There was a pause. "No, Father," Harold replied, sounding puzzled. "Absolutely not. That chapel was built on a slab foundation. No basement, no sublevel. I can swear to that." "Why?" Elias explained everything. The mysterious metal grate, the strange and rhythmic humming, and the unmistakable sound of a person coughing beneath the earth. "That's impossible," Harold responded, his voice low and firm. "I was caretaker there for 2 decades. I would have known if there was anything underground. There was nothing." "Then the only explanation is that something was built after the chapel was demolished," Elias said grimly. "Something Silas Redwood constructed." Harold didn't speak immediately. When he did, his voice was heavy with concern. "That's deeply troubling, Father. What are you going to do?" "I've already called the authorities. The police are on their way to investigate." "I'm coming too," Harold said decisively. "I know that property inside and out. I can be there in 10 minutes. "Thank you," Elias said with relief. He ended the call and leaned back in his seat, clutching his rosary tightly. The beads clicked softly between his fingers as he began to pray. He whispered the familiar prayers with quiet urgency, asking for clarity, for courage, and most of all, for the safety of whoever might be beneath that ground. Despite the comforting rhythm of the rosary, his thoughts refused to settle. Questions swirled just beneath the surface of his calm exterior. Who was down there? Why build a hidden underground room beneath a chapel site? And then, the most chilling question of all, could this have anything to do with the disappearance of the 4 nuns? 28 years had passed since that day, almost to the hour. The idea seemed absurd. No one could survive underground for that long. But still, the timing, the strange chanting, the cough, the undeniable human presence. It was too uncanny to dismiss as coincidence. The distant sound of an approaching engine broke the silence. Turning in his seat, Father Elias spotted a weathered pickup truck turning the corner. It rumbled up the road and came to a stop behind his sedan. Harold Gibbons stepped down from the cab, his boots crunching gravel. His face was lined with age, but his eyes were alert, scanning the road and the perimeter fence with practiced caution. "Father Elias?" Harold called as he approached. "Have the police arrived yet?" "Not yet," Elias replied, stepping out to greet him. "Thank you for coming." Harold gave a short nod, his gaze now fixed on the ornate gate leading into Redwood's estate. "I've been thinking about what you told me. It doesn't make sense. If Redwood built something underground after buying the land, wouldn't the neighbors have noticed? You can't exactly excavate without backhoes and concrete trucks." "Unless he did it slowly," Elias suggested. "Piece by piece over time, or maybe he discovered a natural cavity and simply expanded it." Harold frowned and shook his head. "Not likely. The ground here is solid bedrock under a thin layer of soil. No caves, no natural voids." Before they could continue the discussion, the sound of sirens approached from the north. A police cruiser, lights flashing but siren off, rolled around the bend and pulled up beside them. Two uniformed officers exited the vehicle. One was a seasoned man with a weathered face and flecks of gray at his temples. The other was younger, leaner, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that suggested military training. Their badges identified them as deputies from the Shasta County Sheriff's Department. "Father Morrow?" the older one asked. "Yes, thank you for coming," Elias said, stepping forward. He motioned to Harold beside him. "This is Harold Gibbons. He was the caretaker of St. Dina's Chapel before it was sold." "I'm Deputy Williams," the older officer introduced himself. "And this is Deputy Reynolds." He nodded toward his colleague, who offered a brisk nod but remained silent, surveying the surroundings with trained eyes. "Dispatch tells us you reported hearing sounds, possibly a person, coming from an underground location on private property. Can you explain exactly what you found?" Elias recounted the events from that afternoon in detail: his visit to the old chapel site, the chance discovery of the air vent, the haunting hum and the unmistakable cough, and finally, his decision to call for help. He was careful to acknowledge the unintentional nature of his trespass and expressed his concern for whomever might be down there. Deputy Williams listened closely. When Elias finished, the deputy gave a thoughtful nod. "Right now, our concern is the possibility of someone being in danger. If someone's trapped or being held underground, that takes priority over any boundary issues." Harold stepped forward. "As I told Father Elias earlier, I looked after that chapel for 20 years. There was never any underground room. Whatever's down there was built after the property changed hands." Reynolds, who had been jotting notes in a small leather-bound pad, looked up. "Mr. Redwood is a well-known landowner in this region. This is a serious matter, and we'll proceed carefully. I'm not accusing Mr. Redwood of anything," Elias said quickly, "but I believe there's someone in distress, and I couldn't ignore it." "Understood," said Williams. "Let's take a look. Mr. Gibbons, if you're familiar with the layout, we'd appreciate your input." "Of course," Harold replied. Together, the four men began walking toward the broken portion of the fence. Father Elias led the way, pointing out the damaged section where he had fallen through. The tension in the air grew with every step. Behind the fence, beyond the ornamental landscaping and manicured shrubs, lay the secret that had drawn them all here, silent, buried, waiting. The four men moved cautiously through the opening in the fence, the one Father Elias had inadvertently broken hours earlier. Though the gap was narrow, they each squeezed through in turn, emerging onto Silas Redwood's estate with deliberate steps and an air of restrained urgency. Father Elias led them along the landscaped path, his steps retracing the same route he had taken when first discovering the anomaly. Soon they arrived at the well-manicured section of ornamental shrubbery that concealed the iron grate embedded in the earth. "Here," Elias said quietly, parting the branches to reveal the weathered metal grate. Deputy Williams crouched beside it, running his fingers over the rusting edges. "Old craftsmanship," he remarked. "Doesn't fit with the rest of this place, not even close." Deputy Reynolds joined him, pulling a flashlight from his belt and shining the beam through the bars. The light reached down several feet, but revealed little beyond the descending shaft. "The vent angles off after about 6 feet, he noted. "Can't see much." "Shh," Elias urged, holding up a hand. "Just listen, be still." They obeyed. A hush fell over the group as they strained their ears, attuning themselves to the faint sounds that might rise from the earth. At first, only the familiar ambience of the forest surrounded them. Birdsong filtering through the trees, a breeze dancing through leaves, the occasional creak of shifting branches. Elias began to worry. Had the person below moved? Had the earlier sounds ceased entirely? Then, soft and unmistakable, it came again. A woman's voice, low and wavering, began to hum. The melody drifted upward like incense, delicate and sorrowful. Elias recognized it instantly, even though the voice was fragile, like it had not been used in years. "Salve Regina," Deputy Williams whispered, his brow furrowing with recognition. That's a Marian hymn." Harold gave a slow nod. "It's the antiphon, often sung in convents at the end of Compline, used in monasteries for centuries." The humming continued for several moments before tapering off into silence, replaced by a series of wheezing breaths, shallow, irregular. Then came a dry, rasping cough that echoed faintly from beneath the ground. Deputy Reynolds straightened up, his jaw tight. "There's definitely someone down there," he said, the concern in his voice now overt. "And that cough doesn't sound good. If someone's sick or injured, we need to speak with Mr. Redwood right away," Deputy Williams decided. "This is no longer just curiosity. This is a potential medical emergency. At the very least, it qualifies as a welfare check." "I don't understand," Harold said quietly, shaking his head in disbelief. "That vent wasn't there when the chapel stood. There was never a basement, never anything below ground. How could someone be down there?" "That's exactly what we intend to find out," Williams replied firmly, now entirely in investigative mode. The group made their way back to the public road where their vehicles were parked. The police cruiser led the way, with Father Elias and Harold following close behind. As they approached the main residence, Silas Redwood's imposing estate, the tone of the afternoon shifted palpably. The house looked more forbidding than ever. It loomed against the trees like a fortress, its many tall windows darkened and reflective, giving the impression of eyes watching their every move. At the curb, Williams turned to Elias and Harold. "Please stay here," he instructed. "We're going to speak with Mr. Redwood first." The two civilians nodded and remained beside the vehicles as the deputies walked up the stone path and mounted the front steps. They knocked crisply on the heavy wooden door, but Redwood didn't answer the door. Instead, he appeared a moment later, striding up from the back of the house, still dressed in the sleek athletic wear from earlier, a large German shepherd pacing beside him on a taut leash. His expression twisted as he noticed Elias and Harold waiting by the road. His pace quickened. "It is the meaning of this," Redwood barked as he reached the front of the house, anger blazing in his eyes. "Why are these two on my property again?" Deputy Williams stepped forward calmly. "Mr. Redwood, I'm Deputy Williams, and this is Deputy Reynolds. We're here on official business. We received a report of sounds coming from an apparent underground space near the former chapel site. We'd like to ask you a few questions." Redwood's face flushed with fury. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "First, this priest breaks onto my land like some kind of vigilante, and now he's wasting police time with conspiracy theories? What next?" "No one's making accusations," Reynolds interjected, maintaining a calm, measured tone. "We're here to follow up on a welfare concern." A voice was heard, singing, then coughing. "From beneath your property, someone may be in distress." Redwood scoffed, waving a hand dismissively. "That's absurd. There's no one on my land except me and my dogs. Are you telling me I have a secret prisoner underground now?" "We're not suggesting anything criminal," Williams replied evenly. "But if someone is down there, even if it's a squatter or someone lost, they might need medical assistance. Wouldn't you want to be sure?" Redwood's face twisted further, his features darkening. "No one could have built anything under this land without me knowing. I've owned this property for more than 25 years. I know every inch." Deputy Williams pressed on. "Then, what about the air vent near the old chapel site? It leads down into the earth." "Someone is down there, Mr. Redwood." There was a flicker, a hesitation so brief it might have been missed by most, but Father Elias caught it. For a fraction of a second, something uncertain passed through Redwood's eyes, and then it vanished behind a wall of composure. "I put in a drainage system when I landscaped that area," Redwood said stiffly. "What you're calling an air vent is a decorative cover, that's all. It goes over a runoff pipe. There's nothing sinister." William's voice turned dry. "Drainage systems don't hum hymns and cough, Mr. Redwood." Redwood turned sharply toward Father Elias, his voice now rising. "This man is orchestrating a hoax. He's bitter that I bought the church property and is trying to stir up trouble. For all I know, he planted some kind of speaker playing creepy sounds." Father Elias took a step forward, hands open in front of him. "I would never do such a thing. As God is my witness, I am telling you the truth." Redwood's dog barked, agitated by the tension. The leash jerked taut as Redwood yanked it back. "I will not allow a search without a warrant," Redwood declared. "This is private land." Deputy Reynolds gave a careful nod. "Understood. We can seek a warrant if needed, but we strongly urge you to allow us to check the area. If someone is hurt, time may be critical." "I've already told you, there's nothing there," Redwood growled, though a bead of sweat had begun to form at his temple. But no one was buying his indignation anymore. "I heard a woman's voice coming from that vent," Father Elias said firmly. "We all did, just moments ago." Silas Redwood scoffed, lips curling into a sneer. A priest invoking God while trespassing and spreading lies. How very on-brand. Deputy Williams stepped forward, voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "That's enough, Mr. Redwood. We're not here to argue theology or character. We're asking for your cooperation. This is a welfare matter now. If you choose not to comply, we'll pursue the necessary legal measures." "Then by all means," Redwood replied coolly, his glare unrelenting. "Pursue them. In the meantime, I want these people off my land. If they're still here in 2 minutes, I'll file formal trespassing charges." Williams glanced at Elias and Harold and gave a subtle nod. The message was clear. Retreat for now, regroup later. This wasn't surrender, it was strategy. The 4 men turned away, walking back down the winding driveway to the parked vehicles. As they neared the sheriff's cruiser, Deputy Williams pulled Father Elias aside, his voice low and measured. "Don't lose heart, Father. This isn't the end. I'm going to contact dispatch to pull up Redwood's deed history, property modifications, any prior complaints or police activity. And I want another look at the case file from 1980. The missing nuns. Something's not sitting right with me." Elias felt a wave of gratitude swell in his chest. "Thank you, Deputy. I know how strange this all sounds, but I truly believe someone is down there, and they need help." "I believe you," Williams said simply. "We all heard that voice. Whether it's what you think it is, we'll find out the right way." He clapped Elias gently on the shoulder. "Go to Harold's place for now. We'll be in touch soon." The short drive to Harold Gibbons's cabin was quiet, both men steeped in their thoughts. The truck's wheels crunched softly over the gravel road, framed by towering pine trees whose shadows stretched long in the waning afternoon light. Harold's home sat humbly amid the forest, a simple cabin of weathered wood and a pitched roof, surrounded by bird feeders and wind chimes. "Not much, but it's home," he said, pushing open the creaking screen door. Inside, the space was modest but inviting. Worn but comfortable furniture filled the living room, and a large stone fireplace anchored the far wall. Above it, a simple wooden crucifix hung prominently, casting a long shadow in the flickering firelight. "It's very warm," Elias said sincerely, setting his coat over the back of a chair. While Harold bustled about the small kitchen preparing tea, Elias settled into a well-used armchair. The ticking of a grandfather clock filled the silence as Elias scanned the walls, noting framed photos, fishing rods, and faded newspaper clippings from decades past. "I kept a few items from St. Dinah when it was shut down," Harold called from the kitchen. "They're in a trunk in the spare room. I'll show you after tea." Elias nodded absently, his thoughts still tangled in the mystery of the air vent and the eerie voice that had floated from beneath the ground. "Harold," he said finally, "why do you think the diocese never informed me about the chapel being sold? I was at St. Agnes back then. My sister was one of the missing nuns. You'd think someone would have reached out." Harold returned with 2 steaming mugs, handing one to Elias before settling into the chair opposite. His face was drawn with thought. "It was a decision made out of Sacramento," he said quietly. "Came straight from the bishop's office. And I'll be honest with you, Father. It wasn't handled well." He took a sip of his tea before continuing. "After the disappearances, attendance at the chapel dropped sharply. People were scared, confused. Then came that incident with the bell tower." "What incident?" Elias asked, his brow furrowing. "Structural failure," Harold said. The place had been slowly falling apart. One Sunday morning early in '81, a massive crack opened in the bell tower. The bell, a good 300 pounds of iron, came crashing down. Just missed Thomas Frell, poor guy. He was filling in for me while I was laid up with a busted leg. "Was anyone hurt?" Elias asked. "By some miracle, no," Harold said. "But it was enough. The diocese closed the place that very week. By early '82, they'd officially decommissioned it. Didn't want to sink funds into repairs." "And Redwood bought it soon after?" "Paid cash," Harold confirmed. "More than the land was worth, I heard." Raised some eyebrows, but the diocese needed money to fix up the cathedral. They didn't ask questions. "What did he do with it right after the purchase?" Elias asked, leaning forward slightly. "Demolish the chapel almost immediately," Harold replied. "Had a crew in there within days. Some locals protested, thought it was hasty, but it was all legal. After that, he focused on landscaping, made the place look like a park, but never built anything permanent where the chapel had stood." Elias took a long sip of tea. "Did you ever see signs he was constructing something underground?" Harold hesitated. "Not directly, but in '83 there were reports, strange noises at night, machinery. Some folks claimed to hear digging, drilling, even small tremors." "Tremors?" Elias echoed, alert now. "That's what the authorities called them. Minor seismic activity. But it was oddly concentrated, just around the old chapel grounds. Some folks whispered Redwood was excavating something, but nothing ever came of it. One deputy came to investigate, didn't find anything suspicious, and that was the end of it." "Redwood always had friends in the right places," Elias said quietly. Harold nodded grimly. "Still does. Knows who to donate to, who to charm, keeps himself protected." The 2 men sat in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken fears pressing down on them. Eventually, their conversation drifted to safer subjects. The shifting tides of Eldon Hollow, the aging congregation at St. Agnes, the quiet miracles and disappointments of ministry. Time slipped past unnoticed until Elias's phone rang, shattering the momentary peace. He answered immediately. "Father Morrow speaking." "Father, it's Deputy Williams." The voice on the other end was energized, purposeful. "I've made progress. I spoke with Judge Martinez. She's sympathetic to the concerns you raised and has just signed off on an emergency search warrant. Based on the circumstances, your report, the sounds from the vent, the lack of cooperation from Mr. Redwood, we now have legal grounds to conduct a welfare search of the property." Elias's breath caught in his chest. "That's incredible news, Deputy. Thank you, truly." "We'll be heading back to Redwood's estate within the hour," Williams said. "This time, we'll do it by the book." Elias ended the call, his hand trembling slightly as he lowered the phone. "They're going back in," he said aloud, "with a warrant." Errol's eyes widened. "Then we may finally learn what's under that earth." Elias nodded solemnly, already preparing himself for what might come next. "I heard her," Father Elias insisted, voice steady despite the chill in his veins. "There was a woman's voice coming from that vent. We all heard it." Silas Redwood rolled his eyes, expression steeped in disdain. A priest swearing by God while trespassing and fabricating stories. Predictable. "That's enough," Deputy Williams cut in sharply. His patience had run dry. "Mr. Redwood, we're here for a welfare check, and I'm asking for your voluntary cooperation. If you continue to deny access, we'll escalate through proper legal channels." Redwood's face tightened like a drawn curtain. "Then escalate," he said coldly. "But in the meantime, I want these people off my land. If they're still here in 2 minutes, I'll be filing trespassing charges." Deputy Williams turned to Father Elias and Harold, giving them a silent nod. "Step back, for now." This wasn't defeat, but a temporary withdrawal. The mission was far from over. Back at their vehicle, Williams leaned in close to Elias. "We're not done here, Father. I'm contacting dispatch for property records and to look into Redwood's history with this land. I also want a fresh look at the Nuns' disappearance in 1980. Something isn't adding up." "Thank you," Elias said earnestly. "I know how strange this seems, but someone is down there. I can feel it." Williams met his gaze. "I believe you. And we'll get to the bottom of it, legally." Elias and Harold returned to the older man's nearby cabin to wait. The small home tucked among the pines offered little distraction from the tension mounting in Elias's chest. When his phone rang nearly an hour later, it was Williams on the other end. "Father, we've got a warrant," the deputy said. "Judge Martinez signed off on it after reviewing our body cam footage and hearing our concerns. We're moving in within the hour. I need you to keep your distance. This is now an official operation. For your safety, please stay away." "I understand," Elias said, though every part of him ached to be there. "I'll keep my word," Williams assured him. "If we find anything, you'll be the first civilian I notify." Elias thanked him and ended the call. When Harold overheard the news, he insisted they at least observe from a distance. "If something significant happens," he argued, "our spiritual presence might matter." With reluctance, Williams agreed. "You can stay in your vehicle by the roadside," he told them, "but you must not interfere." Elias and Harold drove out, parking along the public road overlooking Redwood's property. From their vantage, they watched police vehicles converge. 2 cruisers, a forensic van, and even an ambulance, a precaution that turned Elias's stomach. Williams approached the car briefly. "We're going in," he said, holding up a phone. "I've synced my body cam feed to this stream. You can follow along. But don't move from this spot." He helped Elias connect to the live feed, then returned to his team. Through the phone screen, Elias and Harold watched the officers knock at Redwood's door, warrant in hand. The audio was faint, but Redwood's voice was unmistakable, angry, outraged, and offensive. "I need briefing." Despite his protests, the officers methodically searched the house. Redwood, forced to sit in the living room, could only watch. 45 minutes passed before Williams reported no suspicious findings in the house or standard basement. "We're heading to the outbuildings," he said into the feed. "There's a storage shed along the forest road. Redwood confirms its location." The footage showed the team walking a narrow forest trail, Redwood trailing reluctantly. The trees formed an arch overhead, filtering the fading light into dappled shadows. After a while, they arrived at the shed. Larger than expected, about 20 feet square, with aged wooden siding and a rusted metal roof. Redwood's voice crackled through the camera mic. "It's just a garden shed. You're wasting your time." The officers entered. Inside, there were shelves of tools, lawn equipment, and containers of fertilizer. Cobwebs clung to corners. It smelled of old wood and disuse. As the search wrapped up, one officer accidentally dropped a heavy wrench. It hit the wooden floor with a dull thud, followed by a faint, hollow echo. Deputy Reynolds knelt, tapping the boards. "This section sounds different," he said. "And these planks, they're newer." Despite Redwood's renewed objections, the officers began removing the floorboards. Beneath them was a stone staircase descending into darkness. "Mr. Redwood," Williams said flatly, "care to explain?" Redwood's face had drained of color. I don't know anything about that. It must have been here when I bought the place." "No one bought it. Not for a second." "Searching for a key," another officer reported. In a hollow beside the stairwell, partially hidden, they found a corroded iron key. Williams took it, inserted it into the lock on a heavy wooden door at the bottom of the steps. With a loud groan, the door swung open. "We're entering a man-made tunnel," Williams said. "Roughly 6 feet high, 3 feet wide, stone walls supported by wooden beams. This isn't ancient. Someone tried to make it look older than it is." The footage turned darker as they advanced, tactical flashlights sweeping the passageway. The tunnel twisted slightly, leading deeper into the earth. Elias watched with bated breath. He could feel it. They were moving toward the old chapel grounds. Minutes passed. The officers emerged into a wider chamber. The light revealed crude furnishings, a mattress on the floor, a bucket in the corner, a rickety table with the remains of old food. The place reeked of confinement. "There's been habitation here," Reynolds confirmed, "and not recently. This has been lived in for some time." More unsettling was what they found next. Religious iconography drawn on the walls in charcoal. A crucifix etched into stone. The words "Ora pro nobis" scrawled above the mattress in shaky handwriting. Chase and John had never made it a half hour trying to sleep after sunset falls when they stopped to breathe, with John praying on a pillow. Then came a sound, faint but unmistakable, humming, the same haunting melody Elias had heard near the air vent. "Salve Regina," Williams whispered. The officers moved toward a second door, this one iron. They knocked. Nothing. Then a cough. Ragged, weak. "Someone's inside," Reynolds said. "We're forcing it." The door gave after 2 strikes. Inside was a small, windowless room. A woman sat huddled in the corner, skin pallid and eyes sunken. Her gray hair was matted, her lips cracked. "No extract." She looked up, blinking at the lights. "Help me," she rasped. Gasps erupted through the officers' mics. Williams stepped forward. "Ma'am, you're safe now. We're going to get you help." A medic was called in immediately. Through the phone feed, Elias and Harold could see the woman being stabilized. "Father," Williams's voice returned, "we've found a living person down here, female, late middle age. We don't have ID yet, but she may be one of the missing nuns." Elias's rosary slipped through his fingers. He closed his eyes, overwhelmed by a prayer that came unbidden from his heart. They had found her. The faint voice reached out from the shadows, brittle and tremulous. "Help, is someone there?" It was a whisper, barely audible, but enough to stop the officers in their tracks. Deputy Williams immediately trained his flashlight toward the source of the sound. The beam cut through the gloom to reveal a fragile figure, lying on a threadbare mattress. Her appearance was harrowing. Skin stretched thin over hollow cheekbones, lips cracked and dry, hair cut short and graying, and eyes deep-set but startlingly alert. In her gnarled hands she clutched what looked like a handmade wooden rosary, the beads smoothed by years of prayer. "Ma'am," Deputy Williams said softly, kneeling to her level and moving slowly, so as not to frighten her. "I'm Deputy Williams from the Shasta County Sheriff's Department. We're here to help you. Can you tell me your name?" The woman's lips moved with visible effort. A raspy whisper emerged. "Sister Teresa Morrow." Miles away in Harold's parked truck, watching the live stream on a phone screen, Father Elias gasped. The name hit him like a bolt of lightning. His breath caught, and his hand flew to cover his mouth, eyes filling with tears. "My God," he whispered, voice cracking. "It's her. It's my sister." Beside him, Harold Gibbons reached out, placing a steadying hand on his shoulder. He too wore an expression of stunned disbelief, eyes wide, lips slightly parted as he struggled to comprehend the miracle unfolding before them. The camera feed continued to capture the small subterranean chamber, which was lined with dozens of religious carvings, crosses, depictions of saints, scenes from scripture, all crafted from bits of wood, bone, and stone. A lone candle sat on a makeshift altar, its wick long burnt out. On one wall, a large crucifix had been carefully etched into the stone, marking this grim place as a sanctuary shaped by devotion and endurance. "Sister," Deputy Williams continued gently, "we're going to get you medical attention right away, but please, can you tell us if there's anyone else down here with you?" The woman's gaze drifted to the darkest corner of the room, where the flashlight had not yet reached. Her voice, when it came, was barely more than breath. "Beatrice. She's gone now. Gone to God. A long time ago." The camera shifted and revealed what the deputies had feared, a second figure, skeletal, lying still on another mattress. A threadbare blanket barely covered the bones, Time and decay had left little doubt. This was a body, long dead. Deputy Williams straightened and pressed his radio. "We need the medical team down here now," he said urgently, "and notify forensics. We have confirmed human remains." In the truck, Father Elias could no longer contain himself. He flung the door open and leapt out, ignoring Harold's calls behind him. Sprinting toward the police perimeter, his clerical collar flapping against his neck, he approached the officers stationed there. "Please," he begged breathlessly. "That woman, the one you found, it's my sister. I'm Father Elias Marrow. She disappeared 28 years ago. I must see her. I have to. Please." The officer on duty hesitated, then spoke into his radio. After a brief conversation, he gave a reluctant nod and waved Father Elias through. "Wait by the shed," he instructed. "They'll be bringing her out soon. Just stay clear of the path." Father Elias nodded wordlessly and made his way to the indicated spot. Time stretched, became gelatinous as he waited. He whispered prayers under his breath, fingers wrapped around his rosary. His heart pounded with equal measures of fear and wonder. How could this be real? How had she survived? At last, movement stirred at the tunnel's entrance. Emergency personnel emerged, moving with focused urgency. Between them was a stretcher. On it lay the emaciated form of a woman who looked more spirit than flesh. Her features were gaunt, her limbs nearly skeletal under the thermal blanket. Yet when her head turned slightly toward the waiting priest and their eyes met, he knew her. Deep within those exhausted, ancient eyes, he saw Teresa. His Teresa. She recognized him too. Her lips moved, though her voice was too faint to carry. But Father Elias didn't need to hear it. He could read the words as clearly as if they'd been shouted. "God never left me." As the paramedics rushed her to the waiting ambulance, another team emerged, carrying a zipped black body bag, the remains of Sister Beatrice, Elias presumed, the other missing nun. The weight of grief hit him again, but it was now entwined with awe. He turned to see Silas Redwood, flanked by deputies and in handcuffs. Gone was the smug arrogance. In its place was a grim, vacant expression. As Redwood passed by, he suddenly lunged, despite the restraints, and spat at Father Elias, the spittle landing squarely on the priest's cheek. "Proud of yourself, Father?" Redwood hissed venomously before being yanked away by officers. Father Elias calmly wiped his cheek and stood tall. "I count it all joy to suffer for righteousness' sake," he replied solemnly, invoking the scripture without hesitation. Officers buzzed with activity around him. One was heard remarking that a second skeletal body had been located in another chamber of the underground tunnel, possibly another of the missing nuns from decades prior. The implications were staggering. Harold appeared beside Father Elias, having caught up more cautiously. "The ambulance is pulling out," he said softly. "We should go to the hospital." Father Elias nodded, unable to speak through the lump in his throat. Together they returned to the truck and followed the ambulance, its sirens a wail of triumph and sorrow as it carried Teresa away from that unholy prison and into the world again. At the hospital, the emergency bay was a blur of motion. Paramedics wheeled Teresa through the sliding doors, her fragile body wrapped tightly in blankets. Father Elias and Harold parked hastily and rushed to follow, only to be intercepted by hospital staff. "I'm sorry, Father," said a nurse, her voice gentle but firm. "You can't come in with her. The team needs space to assess and treat her. She's in extremely fragile condition." "I understand," Father Elias replied, though every part of him ached to be at his sister's side. "But I'm her brother, her only family. She's been missing for 28 years. I thought she was dead." The nurse's stern expression softened at the weight of his words. "I promise," she said, "we'll do everything possible for her. There's a waiting room just down that hallway. Someone will come speak with you as soon as we know more." Father Elias nodded slowly and turned toward the waiting area, the air thick with antiseptic and hope. For the first time in nearly 3 decades, he had his sister back. Not whole, not unscarred, but alive. And now, at last, the healing could begin. Father Elias allowed Harold to guide him into the hospital's waiting area, a sterile, fluorescent-lit space that offered little comfort. The chairs were stiff and unwelcoming, upholstered in faded vinyl. A coffee table in the middle held a scattered collection of outdated magazines with curled covers, and the walls were adorned with generic watercolor prints of lakes and forests that did little to ease the tension in the air. They sat in silence for several minutes, the magnitude of the day's events weighing too heavily for small talk. Each man was lost in his thoughts, the echo of a whispered voice from the underground chamber still ringing in their ears. The silence between them was not awkward. It was reverent, the kind of stillness born from shared shock and spiritual gravity. Finally, Harold spoke, his voice soft but firm. "It's a miracle, Father. After all these years, to find her alive." Father Elias nodded slowly, his eyes misty. "A miracle indeed," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "though I dread to imagine what she had to endure to survive in that place." Harold glanced sideways, then said with quiet conviction, "She had her faith. Sometimes that's enough to keep a soul intact." The priest found comfort in the simplicity of the statement. His thoughts drifted to the religious carvings that had lined the chamber's stone walls, crude depictions of saints and crosses etched by hands that refused to forget God, even in darkness. He realized with sudden urgency that the community at St. Agnes would need to know. They had prayed for decades without answers. Now, at long last, they had one. Just as he reached into his pocket to retrieve his phone, it vibrated in his hand. The screen displayed Deputy Williams's number. "Deputy," Father Elias answered immediately, rising from his seat. "I'm at the hospital now. My sister is being seen by the doctors." "That's good to hear, Father," Williams replied. His voice was level, but carried a palpable tension. "I wanted to give you an update on the investigation. We have Mr. Redwood in custody. He's clammed up, refusing to speak without legal counsel present, but during the second search of his residence, we discovered something substantial. A journal. He's been documenting everything." Elias felt his stomach drop. "What kind of journal? What's in it?" There was a pause, as if the deputy was bracing himself. "It's disturbing, Father. In it, Redwood details decades of deep-seated hatred for the Catholic Church, especially for nuns. He's been keeping these writings since the late 1970s. There are pages describing his growing obsession with the women at St. Dina's." "But why?" Elias asked, struggling to comprehend the level of hate such an obsession would require. What could drive a person to such madness? Williams hesitated again before answering. According to his writings, Redwood's mother abandoned him shortly after birth. He was left with his grandmother, who later became a nun. He never met his mother, and his grandmother, she was extremely devout, rigidly Catholic. He wrote about being physically punished in the name of religious correction. He grew up resenting the church and blaming religious women for everything he lacked in life. The pain in Elias's chest deepened. "So much brokenness," he murmured. "So much darkness, twisted into hate. And there's more." Williams continued grimly. "The journal outlines what happened to the other nuns, Sisters Mildred Hayes and Joan Keller. According to his notes, they died within the first year. Age and the harsh conditions took their toll." Elias closed his eyes and crossed himself, whispering, "May their souls find the peace they were denied." "Your sister Teresa and Sister Beatrice survived longer," Williams said. "Sister Beatrice, by Redwood's own admission, died sometime in the early 1990s from an untreated illness, most likely a respiratory infection. But my sister, how did she survive when the others didn't?" Elias asked, dreading the answer. "But my sister..." There was another pause. "Redwood's fixation on her became obsessive," Williams said. "He separated her from the others after Beatrice died, treated her differently. There are photographs in the journal, writings that suggest he subjected her to prolonged psychological manipulation, and worse." Father Elias's stomach turned. His breath caught in his throat. "No," he whispered. "Dear God, No, I'm sorry, Father, Williams said, his voice gentle now. The signs of long-term abuse are clear, but I have to tell you, it's miraculous that she maintained her faith, her mind. Elias placed a hand over his heart, forcing himself to breathe deeply. My sister did not sin, he said slowly, each word deliberate. She was a victim. The sin belongs entirely to her captor. Of course, Williams agreed solemnly. No one would ever suggest otherwise. Harold, who had silently been listening to the one-sided conversation, placed a reassuring hand on the priest's shoulder, his support unwavering. There's one more thing you should know, Williams continued. The journal details exactly how he managed to abduct 4 nuns without raising suspicion. It was meticulous. He'd been watching them for months, observing their routines, their schedules. When he learned they'd be alone for a private retreat, he made his move. But how? Elias pressed. There was no sign of forced entry, no struggle. How could he do that without leaving a trace? He posed as a neighbor, Williams replied, brought them tea and supplies under the guise of friendliness. The tea was drugged. The 2 elder nuns drank it first. When they began to feel ill, the younger ones helped them lie down. That's when he struck. Overpowered them one by one. Your sister almost escaped. She fought. She reached the door. But he hit her and later drugged her too. Elias imagined Teresa's struggle, the terror, the courage, the violence, and felt sick. He removed them through a service corridor that had been part of the original chapel's design, loaded them into his vehicle in the dead of night. Then he cleaned the chapel meticulously, burned letters, bedding, anything with trace evidence, even scrubbed the floors with lye. By the time anyone realized something was wrong, there was nothing left to find. And the investigation? Elias asked, thinking of the weeks he'd spent, waiting, praying, pleading for answers back in 1980. It wasn't like today, Williams said. This was a rural jurisdiction with limited resources. Forensics weren't what they are now. Once initial searches came up empty, it went cold. Redwood was never even considered. Wealthy, well-connected, no criminal record. Then he bought the chapel land through a proxy company. Elias closed his eyes again, the pieces clicking together. Demolished it. Covered it all. Hid the truth. Exactly, Williams said. We suspect he built that underground space in secret during the early ADS, excavation disguised as landscaping. There was a pause, both men reflecting on the dark legacy now unearthed. Thank you for telling me, Elias said finally, his voice quiet but firm. You deserved to know, Williams replied. You helped uncover this, and you may have saved her life. After acquiring the former chapel grounds, Silas Redwood orchestrated the construction of an elaborate underground network, chambers carved into the earth and a concealed tunnel that led from beneath the demolished sanctuary to a seemingly innocuous storage shed. This clandestine effort explained the strange nocturnal machinery noises and the faint tremors that had puzzled locals back in 1983. How did no one catch this? Harold exclaimed, his voice rising with incredulity. There were complaints, people heard things. How did it just get swept under the rug? Father Elias relayed the question to Deputy Williams, still on the phone. On the other end, Williams sighed heavily, his frustration palpable even through the speaker. It's difficult to admit, but Redwood's journal suggests he paid off a few officials, people in zoning and code enforcement, to ignore the complaints. He had the money, the influence, and apparently a long-standing plan. We're launching an internal review to identify who might have accepted those bribes. The truth will come out. Before Father Elias could respond, a doctor in scrubs approached, clipboard in hand, her expression serious but not unkind. Are you Father Morrow, brother to Sister Teresa? She asked gently. Yes, Father Elias replied, ending the call and rising to his feet. I'm her brother. How is she? The doctor, who introduced herself as Dr. Chen, motioned for them to sit. She appeared to be in her 40s, with intelligent eyes and a calm demeanor honed by years of difficult conversations. Your sister is stable for the moment, she began carefully, but her condition is extremely fragile. She's suffering from severe malnutrition, profound muscle atrophy, and a host of vitamin deficiencies, especially D, due to prolonged deprivation of sunlight. X-rays also show evidence of multiple healed fractures, injuries that were never properly treated. Father Elias gripped the arms of the chair, his knuckles white as he absorbed the grim details. The most pressing concern, Dr. Chen continued, is reintroducing her to the outside world in a medically safe way. After being underground for so long, her immune system is highly compromised. We're concerned about even the most common bacteria. Additionally, her vision has adapted to darkness. Bright lights could cause pain or disorientation for weeks, possibly longer. "When can I see her?" he asked softly. "She's being transferred to the ICU as we speak. Once she's stabilized, we can allow a short visit. But you'll need to wear full protective gear, mask, gown, gloves. And even then, the visit must be brief." "I've waited 28 years, Father Elias said, his voice thick with emotion. "I can wait a few more hours if it means protecting her." Dr. Chen's expression softened. "She asked for you, you know. The moment she was lucid, she asked whether her brother had come. She said she always knew you would find her." Tears welled in Father Elias's eyes. He pressed a hand over his heart. "She never lost faith." "Apparently not," Dr. Chen replied. "According to the paramedics, she clutched a handmade rosary, crafted from wood fragments and bits of thread. She wouldn't part with it even during treatment." "That sounds like her," Father Elias murmured, a bittersweet smile breaking through his tears. "Her faith was always unshakable. Even as a child, she believed in the power of prayer more than anyone I've ever known." Dr. Chen stood. "A nurse will come for you shortly. We'll do everything in our power to help her heal." After she left, Father Elias turned to Harold. "Would you mind if I spent a few moments in the chapel? I need to speak to God." "Of course," Harold replied. "I'll be right here if there's any news." Father Elias made his way to the hospital's chapel, a small, non-denominational room designed for quiet reflection. Inside, it was dimly lit and still. He knelt before the simple altar, bowing his head as the floodgates of emotion finally opened. "Thank you, Lord," he whispered. "Thank you for watching over her all these years. Thank you for not letting me give up." Tears streamed down his face as he prayed, not just for his sister's healing, but for peace, for understanding, for strength, for the will to forgive the evil that had robbed them of so many years. The silence of the chapel enfolded him, and amid it, a sense of calm slowly returned. He didn't have all the answers, but he no longer needed them. Teresa was alive. That was enough. When he returned to the waiting room, a nurse was waiting. "She's ready," she said. "Please follow me. We've prepared everything for your visit." Dressed in a gown, gloves, and mask, Father Elias followed her through a series of antiseptic-scented hallways to the ICU. The room he entered was filled with the quiet hum of machines. In the bed lay Sister Teresa, barely a shadow of the young woman who had once led hymns at St. Dena's chapel. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her frame impossibly thin, but her eyes, when they opened, still held that unmistakable spark. "Elias," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. "Yes," he choked out, falling to his knees beside her bed. "It's me. I'm here." I knew you'd find me," she said, managing a faint smile. "I never stopped looking, not for a single day." "I told Beatrice," she whispered. "God would send you. I always believed." He reached for her hand, gently taking it into his gloved one. "I'm so sorry it took so long." "God's time," she murmured, "always perfect." The nurse stepped close, tapping Father Elias's shoulder. "Just a minute more." He nodded, leaning close to his sister. "I'm not going far. I'll be just outside the door. We have so much to catch up on." She nodded faintly, then opened her eyes once more. "Tell me," she began, her voice strained. "The church, is it still strong?" Father Elias smiled behind his mask, tears stinging his eyes once more. "Yes, Tess. The gates of hell have not prevailed against it. We are still here." "Good," she whispered, the word barely audible. "So good." As he exited the room, Father Elias felt a profound sense of reverence. Even after nearly 3 decades of imprisonment, of deprivation, and darkness, Teresa's first concern wasn't herself. It was for the church, for her faith, for God. He stepped into the corridor, closed his eyes, and offered a silent prayer. For her healing, for Sister Beatrix, whose body had been found too late, for the 2 older nuns, gone before, and even in some small, trembling corner of his soul, for Silas Redwood, that somehow justice would be served, and that God might turn even this darkness into light.